Hello! Today we're going to talk about The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. As usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. And now today's topic is how a lack of purpose can put you at risk of falling into life's passions, leaving you frustrated and desperate. But before we get into it, let me explain why we should even care about The Sorrows of Young Werther in the first place. Well, Goethe published this novel in 1774, which puts it at the very start of the Romantic movement, the time of intuitive thinking, individualism, and emotional turmoil. And what's interesting is that The Sorrows of Young Werther was actually one of the earliest sparks that led to the Romantic era. The novel became the world's first bestseller. Bonaparte took it with him on his campaign to Egypt, and it created a whole trend called Werther Fever, where people started to dress like the main character. But Werther Fever wasn't just about fashion, as another theme in the novel actually led some countries to ban it altogether. And I'm going to tell you more about it, but at the end of the video, so that I don't spoil you, the story of The Sorrows of Young Werther. So now we finally begin the story with a letter written by Werther to his friend Wilhelm. And here we get a first insight into Werther's character, as he writes that he's extremely happy about leaving his friend's property, as even though he will of course miss Wilhelm very much, at the same time now he's free from the love affair that he got himself into. Because you see, Werther was involved with a woman called Leonora, but he also liked spending time with her sister, and that quickly turned into some flirting. And in the letter he kind of tries to convince himself that he was blameless in this situation, because after all it was the sister's fault that her heart began to feel a deep passion towards him. But then he thinks it through and he realizes that, well, it's not like he was not encouraging those emotions, and so maybe he was not so blameless after all. He then promises to improve and also to concentrate on the present moment instead of worrying himself with the memories of his past sorrows. And after that we get a bit of information about his current whereabouts. He recently arrived at a nobleman's estate where he met his aunt, who turned out to be a pretty agreeable woman, despite what Werther's mother had told him. And Werther makes an interesting observation here, writing that it seems that most problems in life come from misunderstanding rather from malice, which is also something that I tend to believe, to be honest. Now, Werther enjoys his time in the estate, and he spends his days in healing solitude, surrounded by beautiful nature of a nearby garden. And he describes the garden as simple, not something designed by a professional gardener, but rather planned by a man who wanted it for the enjoyment of his own sensitive heart. Here he finds pleasure in laying down among the tall grass by the trickling stream and feeling the presence of God, which fills him with eternal bliss. And he's so absorbed in the pleasure and blissfulness of life that he completely neglects his purpose, which is to paint, because Werther is supposed to be an artist. But instead of taking action towards his purpose, he lets himself drown in the passions and sensations of the world. Then, in one of the letters to Wilhelm, Werther forbids his friend from sending him any new books, as he reveals that he's already too agitated to let anything stir his heart even more. The only author Werther tolerates is Homer, as he cools the burning fever of his blood. And Werther himself admits here that he often experiences sudden transitions from sorrow to joy and from sweet melancholy to violent passion. And then he also adds something quite concerning, I would say, as he writes, "I treat my poor heart like a sick child and gratify its every fancy," which is probably not something that you should do. Now, after a couple of days in this new place, Werther slowly falls into boredom, as even though he spends some time with the common people, he concludes that he's made all sorts of acquaintances, but he still hasn't found his society. And so that leads him to spiral down into memories of his past, where he finds the sorrows of his first infatuation. In his youth, Werther had a close friend whom he describes in the following way: "But she has been mine. I have possessed that heart, that noble soul, in whose presence I seemed to be more than I really was. because I was all that I could be. But unfortunately, the woman died, leaving Werther alone and unable to forget about her. And so Werther now goes through his days completely lost in memory until suddenly something pulls him out of it. He writes about this in one of his letters to his friend, where he describes that as he was meeting many new people, he had the pleasure of getting to know a very worthy person. And he describes his new acquaintance as an open-hearted judge with a family of 9 children, the most praised of whom is his eldest daughter. And then Werther ends the letter writing that the judge invited him to visit his property nearby. After that, we get a bit into Werther's life philosophy, which greatly explains why he's constantly chasing after the pleasures of life instead of grounding himself in any sort of purpose. He says that the life of a man is but a dream, and that we're wasting all of our energy on basic necessities which provide nothing but a prolonging of our existence. And when he's thinking about the lack of meaning in human's life, he can't help but retreat into his own internal world, where he finds imagination and desires that help him go through life in this semi-dissociated state. And then he touches upon the fact that we think that it's only children who are not able to comprehend the cause of their desires, but Werther thinks that the same actually goes for adults, as many people aren't really influenced by any sort of fixed motives, and they are rather chasing what's pleasurable and escape from discomfort. And Werther concludes here that the happiest people are like children, either amusing themselves with simple things or taking pride in their achievements to the point of treating them as something bigger than they really are. But Werther is of course neither of those, as he sees the vanity of it all, and so he instead retreats into himself, content and at peace with the thought that he can escape his prison whenever he wants to, simply by ending his life. Following that, we get another letter from Werther where he describes his newest discovery, a cozy place called Valheim. There, Werther found an incredibly charming spot right under 2 linden trees, where he regularly asks for a chair and a table to be brought out of a nearby inn so that he can drink his coffee and read Homer in peace. And on top of that, he befriends some local children and their mother, and in his free time he practices drawing landscapes. Now, time passes and we find ourselves in the middle of June, and Werther writes a letter to his friend saying that he was not really keeping in touch recently because his life has been very pleasant, and the reason for that is that he recently met someone who has basically won his heart. A woman so ideal in his eyes that he calls her an angel. She has a perfect combination of simplicity with deep understanding, gentleness with assertiveness, and a peaceful mind with an active life. And as he keeps describing her, he's so enchanted by the memories of her that he decides to visit her in the middle of writing the letter. And after he comes back, he begins to describe the day they've met. It happened one evening when Werther was about to attend a ball, and his companion told him that on their way they're going to pick up the eldest daughter of the district judge, whom Werther met a couple of days before. And his companion added that Werther should be wary of falling for the woman, as she's already engaged to a very worthy man who is currently out of the city due to some financial matters. At sunset, they arrived in front of the house. Werther went inside, and that's when he first saw her. Charlotte was surrounded by her siblings, 6 children aged from 11 to 2 years old, running around the hall joyfully. And Charlotte was of middle height, with a lovely figure, dressed in a white robe with pink ribbons, and in her hand she had a loaf of bread, from which she was cutting slices and giving them to her siblings. And as Charlotte noticed Werther, she immediately apologized for making everyone wait, saying that all the preparations for the ball made her forget about feeding her siblings, who insist that it has to be her who feeds them. And to this, Werther uttered something back, but at this point his soul was completely absorbed by everything about her. And then the youngest child came up to Werther, and Charlotte told him to shake hands with his cousin. To which Werther got pretty excited, and he immediately asked if she thinks that he deserves the happiness of being related to her. But she kindly answered that it's really not a big deal, as her family is rather large, and so she has many cousins anyway. And after that, they left for the ball, leaving the kids very sad that they have to spend the night without their dearest sister. Then, as they were traveling to the ball, Charlotte spoke about the fact that when she was younger, she loved nothing but romances, especially when she had some free time, during which she could just sit in a corner and enter with her whole heart and soul into the joys or sorrows of some fictional characters. But now that she's older and she reads less frequently, she prefers books that are tailored specifically to her taste and life, as she seeks books that reflect her situation in life. And now, as you might imagine, at this point, Werther is just completely enchanted by Charlotte, and they speak through the whole ride as if no one else in the world exists. After some time, they finally got to the ball, and by that point, Werther couldn't think about anything but Charlotte. And his infatuation intensified even more after she asked him to waltz together. Then, as they were dancing, Werther basically felt like he was in heaven, holding and cherishing the loveliest woman he ever met. And it was such an intimate experience for him that he made a vow to himself: any woman that he's ever going to love will never be allowed to waltz with another man. After that, they took a short break and later began dancing again, and as they were doing so, another older lady looked at Charlotte with a smile and playfully threatened her by repeating the name Albert. To this, Werther asked who Albert was, and Charlotte answered that he was a worthy man to whom she was engaged. Now, Werther obviously knew about this, but the information still shocked him a bit, as he just simply forgot about this, being so enchanted by Charlotte. They then tried to dance a bit longer, but soon a great storm appeared on the horizon, a thunder was heard above the music, and everyone got pretty terrified. But Charlotte was able to quickly bring back the good atmosphere by initiating some silly games, and after that, everyone, now of course in a better mood, gathered into some smaller groups, while Charlotte and Werther went into a private corner next to a window. And there she revealed that she was actually probably even more frightened than others, but she wanted to keep up the good spirits, and so this is why she initiated playing those silly games. After that, Charlotte leaned on her arm, her eyes fixed on the horizon and the passing storm, and then she looked up and finally at Werther, who immediately noticed tears in her eyes. She then placed her hand on his own and said the name Klopstock, who wrote a wonderful ode about a storm and praised God for creating it. And so, as you might imagine, that was almost too much for Werther, who then bent over her hand, kissed it, while crying from all of the emotions that he felt. After that, we get a couple of letters from Werther to his friend Wilhelm, where he writes that from this point on, he basically started to feel as if God had blessed him with the purest joy in life, and he even moved permanently to Valheim just to be closer to Charlotte. And then we get a description of one particular situation that happened as he was visiting her. Because one day, a doctor came from the town, and as he stepped into the house, he found Werther playing with Charlotte's siblings and even himself behaving like a child while doing so. And the doctor was not extremely excited about what he saw, as he even concluded that Werther is just spoiling the judge's children. But to this, Werther comments in his letter that nothing affects his heart as much as children, as he's able to see all the potential that they have and also their pure and unpolluted nature. And he actually brings up the Bible here, where it said that we should become like children in order to enter the kingdom of God. And Werther is actually quite concerned here that we're trying to tell children what to do and how to behave, while in reality he thinks that it should be the other way around. And now, of course, I have something to say about this, because I think that he kind of lacks the complexity of the Bible, and I just think that it's not that simple. It's just not as simple as this one verse. So first we're going to read the fragment from the Bible. It says, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And now, what does this mean? Well, I don't know exactly, but I can give you my interpretation of that. Because I think that it's not really about being fully like children. Because, like, think about this. Does the Bible tell you to just run around, not be aware of your surroundings, and just kind of act on your whims? I don't really think so. And so I think that it's more about your heart. And also because, like, the concept of the heart in the Bible is kind of big and important. But when I say the heart, I usually mean like your first reaction to a particular situation. So like, let's take for example, when someone hurts you, you can have this like the first reaction to hurt them back to get the revenge. But you can kind of like train yourself step by step into having a reaction of forgiving the person. And I can think that you can change a lot of things like this in yourself, like a lot of reactions that you have to certain situations. I think that you can change a lot. Yeah. But you have to do it consistently. Yeah, and it's kind of like a hard process sometimes. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it is. So I mean like your first reaction to a situation, you know? So yeah, I think that it talks more about the heart and like your motives. But as I'm saying, this is my interpretation, so I don't really know. But this is just kind of what makes the most sense to me. Because then when I also see Jesus and just like some other lessons from the Bible, I usually get this impression that our minds should be actually very sharp and wise. And so there's also this fragment that I really like in the context of this interpretation. And you know, it may be a little bit of a reach, it may be, but I think that it really matches this whole concept. The fragment that says, "See, I'm sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." And now, of course, it's taken from like a larger context, but I think that it really serves as a very wise advice that your heart and your motives should be very pure and innocent, but at the same time, your mind should be very aware and wise. Because think about this, like, Jesus was exactly like this. His heart was so extremely pure, but at the same time, the man was sharp. Like, he was very sharp. You could not fool him. No way. And even when he himself was a child, he was giving like profound answers to the teachers in the temple. So based on Jesus himself, I believe that it kind of makes sense that your heart and your motives should be very pure and innocent, but at the same time, your mind should be very, very aware and wise. Now, going back to Werther, it's already July, and we learn from Werther's letter that he's been spending a lot of time with Charlotte. And as you might expect, at this point, Werther is just completely infatuated with her, to the point where he idealizes her a lot and he treats her as this like perfect goddess. And then he writes that God deals with us by giving us those innocent delusions that make us the happiest we can be. And that's just so incredibly unbiblical. And now what's interesting in Werther's next couple of letters is that we can clearly see that Charlotte is living her life just as usual. She's taking care of her siblings, she visits her sick friend in the hospital, and she also spends time with her other friends. But Werther, on the other hand, has completely lost all the purpose of his life, as he has completely stopped drawing, he also stopped meeting new people on his own, and he's now either spending his time with Charlotte or thinking about meeting with her again. And so it's kind of like he not only lost his purpose, but also his whole identity. And then in the middle of July, Werther deludes himself into thinking that Charlotte loves him, even though she often speaks about her soon-to-be husband with such warmth and affection that makes Werther feel pretty defeated. And Werther spirals more and more into obsession, as soon he's not able to care about anything other than Charlotte, and he writes to his friend, I shall see her today. I exclaim with delight when I rise in the morning and look out with gladness of heart at the bright, beautiful sun. I shall see her today, and then I have no further wish to form. All is included in that one thought. And soon his family actually starts to worry about him, and his mother wishes that he could find any sort of employment, but to this Werther just concludes that it's all meaningless, and people who go after money, power, or anything similar are no better than fools. And then at the end of July, Werther actually reveals that he wondered whether he should see Charlotte less often, but at this point her presence became an addiction to him. And now he often finds himself in her place without even planning to, just as if he no longer had any sort of control over himself. But then at the very end of the month, suddenly Albert comes back. And that of course is Charlotte's fiancé. And Werther describes him as superior to himself because it's very hard to find any sort of flaws in Albert, and on top of that he's very considerate and also has a lot of respect towards his soon-to-be wife. And then Albert is further described as a man of a stable temperament, but still very rich in emotions and also well aware of the treasure that Charlotte is to him. And then at the end of the letter, Werther concludes that his pleasure of seeing Charlotte is now over, as Albert is here to stay. But of course he's not able to keep that promise, and so he still visits Charlotte pretty frequently, either waiting for her to be alone or behaving like a complete fool in front of the couple. And now we move to August, and Wilhelm gets actually pretty concerned about his friend, and so he writes to him that the truth is actually pretty simple. Werther either has a chance of getting together with Charlotte or not. If yes, then he should pursue her, and if not, then he should get himself together. But to this, Werther replies that it's just not that simple. But at least he's now pretty aware of his situation, as he recently found his diary, which he neglected greatly, and upon reading it, he realized how foolishly he has entangled himself in this whole situation, despite knowing that he has no chances of getting together with Charlotte. And so, what does he do? Does he cut contact with her? Does he try to find new people, or maybe come back to his paintings? No. Werther makes friends with Albert. They begin to spend a lot of time together, with Albert showing great affection towards Werther, and of course they talk a lot about Charlotte. And then Albert gives us a little bit of her lore, as he says that when Charlotte's mother was dying, she had committed the house and the children to Charlotte and committed her to Albert. And since then, a new spirit came over Charlotte, as she now had to be the mother to her siblings, and she did so perfectly, devoting every minute to loving and caring for the children. But then Werther also writes in one of his letters about a slight conflict that he recently had with Albert, because one time he went into his room and he asked Albert if he would be willing to lend him some of his pistols, as he wanted to take them along for a horseback ride. Albert agreed. He handed him the pistols and then started to tell a story about a situation that made him extremely cautious about keeping them loaded. And as he was in the middle of the story, Werther kinda playfully pointed one of the pistols to his own forehead. Now, as you might imagine, Albert was not extremely excited about this reaction, and so he said that he's not even able to comprehend how a man can be mad enough to even entertain such an idea. To which Werther said that, well, Albert shouldn't be so quick to judge before examining the motives behind actions. And then he gives us some excuses for a pretty bad behavior. So, like, for example, who shall throw the first stone at a husband who, in the heat of just resentment, sacrifices his faithless wife and her lover? And now, to all of this, Albert says to him, that is quite another thing, because a man under the influence of violent passion loses all power of reflection and is regarded as intoxicated or insane. But Werther, being under the influence of his violent passion, calls Albert a calm, moral man who thinks that he's better than others, which makes him no better than a Pharisee. And then Werther tries to make a case that only those deemed by others as insane brain are able to accomplish great actions. And to this, Albert tries to calm him down a little bit, saying that this is just one of his extravagant moods and that he exaggerates everything said to him. And besides, you can't really say that taking your own life is a great action, as it's rather a sign of weakness, because you have to be strong in order to endure life's sufferings, and taking your own life is just escaping from those. But in response, Werther exaggerates again and he gives this big monologue, and in general he gives off this vibe of a person who is not able to have any sort of control over their emotions and doesn't want to be held responsible in any shape or form, which is a pretty dangerous way to think, I think, because it's like you have to have some sort of control over your emotions, you know? Like, emotions are nice, of course, even intense emotions, to be honest. Like, yeah, I think that intense emotions can be so extremely nice, but you kind of have to have the ability to, you know, put your reason above your emotions. And if you're not able to do that, then that becomes quite dangerous, both for you and for the people around. And it's especially dangerous with Werther because it's not like he only behaves like this, like he actually thinks that this is the right thing to do and the right way to live. And so then Werther, still under the influence of his emotional turmoil, leaves the room without reaching any sort of understanding with Albert. Following that, Werther writes to Wilhelm that he's still seeing Charlotte on a regular basis, and on top of that, he's getting closer to her siblings, who now trust him as much as they trust their sister. But in private, Werther becomes more and more miserable as Charlotte now begins to appear in his dreams where they are happily together, but then as Werther wakes up, he realizes the harsh truth and then he cries his eyes out. And soon he writes that he's not even able to do anything as he doesn't feel the beauty of nature anymore and books became distasteful to him. And Werther actually senses himself that his problem is in the lack of purpose in his life, because in one of the letters he writes that he really wishes to be either a common worker who only has one pursuit for the day, or Albert, who is constantly busy with some paperwork. But that's kind of the thing about Werther, because he knows what's bad for him and he knows what would be good for him, but he doesn't really feel any responsibility over his life, so it's almost like life is just happening to him and he can either like or dislike the situation he finds himself in. And so he still spends a lot of time with Charlotte, yearning for her with all of his being, and also sometimes crying his eyes out on her shoulder. After that, September comes and Werther finally realizes that he just has to go away and leave the city completely. And so he plans his departure, but before he leaves, he meets with Albert and Charlotte one last time in the garden. There, they mostly speak about the last days of Charlotte's mother, where she gave her children to Charlotte and Charlotte to Albert. And the pair gets pretty emotional about the memories, while Werther holds Charlotte's hand a bit longer than she would like, and then after a while the pair gets up and they say goodbye to Werther, unaware that he plans to leave the next morning. Following that, we move a bit in time and it's now October, and Werther writes to his friend that he's been feeling a bit better now that he's surrounded by other people, as in his view nothing is as dangerous as solitude. And his reasoning is that our imagination likes to idealize people, and because of that, when we have this idealized version or like image of a person, then we start to feel inferior to them, and so then we are constantly tormented by our own imperfections. But if we instead concentrate on work, then we quickly realize that we're actually doing better than many others, and that gives us a great feeling of self-worth. And so Werther works for some time, but he quickly starts to complain about people at his work because they seem very blinded by the shallow desire to just climb the social ladder, as if that alone could add to their value as a human being. And this observation that people in the city seem to care, well, essentially only about their ego, is what makes Werther more and more irritated. But then he meets a young woman whom he calls Miss B, and he describes her as one of the rare people here who did not adopt this artificial way of being. But apart from that, Werther suffers in the city, surrounded by people who are blinded by the false importance of their social status. Following that, we find ourselves in an inn, and we see here Werther sitting down and writing a letter. It's now the middle of January, a raging snowstorm is seen outside the window, and the first person who comes to Werther's mind is of course Charlotte, and so he begins writing to her. In the letter he writes about how bad the local atmosphere is for him, and he begins to experience a tremendous feeling of derealization, where he basically sees himself as just another actor that has to play his role. And he describes that at this point he doesn't even have a reason to go to sleep or to wake up in the morning. The only person who shares his sorrows is of course Miss B, who is actually pretty similar to Charlotte because of her uncorrupted soul. And so Werther describes how often they dream about living together in the countryside, and then he also reveals that very often they also talk about Charlotte and how amazing she is. And then Werther ends his letter by lamenting why is he not able to just sit with Charlotte and her siblings in their home like he used to before Albert arrived, and shortly after that Werther leaves the inn. Now from the next couple of letters we learn that in February Charlotte finally married Albert, and that left Werther feeling like he will now always be second in her heart. Then in March Werther finally breaks down and he writes that he's just not able to continue living like this, and then he blames his family and his friend for pushing him into a job he was never suited for. And this mental breakdown was actually caused by a recent event that Werther got himself into, because he was spending some time at his friend's house, but he forgot that on the same day a large part of the local aristocracy was also expected to gather here. And so soon people from the higher spheres began to gather here, and Werther was kinda taken back by this, but he didn't really think much of it. And then upon the arrival of his friend Miss B, Werther felt a bit better, and so he just decided to stay close to her and only speak with her. But soon he noticed that she's actually pretty uncomfortable, almost as if his presence confused her, and that pretty much broke Werther, as he realized that she was just like everyone else here. And so he stayed a bit longer, but soon everyone started to look at him weirdly and also whisper between themselves. And then someone pulled him aside and told him that the company was rather displeased by his presence, as he wasn't part of the aristocracy, and so he was asked to leave, and he did. And he kind of tried to pretend that he was unmoved by this whole situation, but soon everyone started to talk about this, and what's even worse, everyone started to pity him, which brought Werther tremendous amount of emotional turmoil. And you know, that's kind of the thing here, because I think that yeah, Werther might be right when it comes to the meaningless of the social status. Or like, you know, it can be important in the context of society, but like when it comes to your value as a human, then no, not that much. But then again, feeling so much aversion towards it, I feel like it's not the answer, because you're then essentially doing the same thing, which is that you just put too much importance on the thing. So really, like, I think that the aristocracy being so obsessed with their position and then Werther feeling so much aversion towards it, I feel like this is just kind of like two sides of the same coin when you really think about this. And in reality, I think that both sides here feel too much pride, because like the aristocracy feels better than others because of their status, but then Werther feels better than them because he sees through it. And so it's like, I don't know, it's just kind of like fighting pride with pride. And so yeah, I just kind of feel like this is maybe not the answer to that, you know, because it's just like, it's still putting too much importance on the thing, but just from the other side, basically. So yeah. Coming back to the story, Werther later meets with Miss B, and she explains to him that she was not destined to cause him harm, but just because it was required of her. And she says that after the event, her aunt gave her a big lecture about why Werther is a bad company, and she was not even allowed to say anything to defend him. And she adds that now people will rejoice over the punishment of his pride, which makes Werther feel extreme emotional turmoil which then leads him into thinking about punishing those who said those things and also about ending his own life. And then in the middle of March, Werther writes that he has issued a resignation from his job without asking his family for a permission, as he knew that they would do everything in their power to convince him to stay. Other than that, Werther informed his friend that an unnamed prince was very pleased with his company, and so because of that, he has invited him to stay in his house in the countryside for the entire spring. And so he did. He spent some time there, but very quickly he started to complain about his new company, as he did not really feel good there, especially considering that the prince turned out to be a man of ordinary understanding, and what's even worse, his understanding of art was based on cold rules and technical terms. And then at the end of July, Werther laments that he wants nothing more but for Charlotte to be his wife, and he even dares to write that she would be happier with him than with Albert. And his reasoning is that Albert is just not sensitive enough for Charlotte, and so she for sure doesn't feel the same emotional connection that she feels with Werther. And so soon Werther begins to dream about Albert dying, because then Charlotte would be free for him to get. And not long after that, Werther finds himself back at Charlotte's house, where he spirals even worse than before. Because, for example, there was this one situation where Werther found a letter on a table, and so he read it, and the letter was from Charlotte to Albert, and she wrote there that she wishes for her dearest husband to come back home as soon as possible, as she misses him greatly. And after Werther read it, he smiled, and Charlotte was like, why are you smiling now? And he answered that, well, for a moment he imagined that this note was written to him. And as you might imagine, she was not especially excited about this response. And then we are described a situation which I'm kind of not a fan of, to be honest, because, you know, Charlotte is described as a very innocent woman, but I can kind of see that she's leading Werther on a little bit, especially later, because, you know, in the beginning, I guess they were just friends and everything, but later, especially after he comes back, it's pretty obvious that he's extremely infatuated with her. And so, like, sometimes she does some things that I really feel like is just leading him on, and it's not very nice of her to do, I guess. And so this time Werther came to visit her, and he kissed her hand tenderly, and then after that noticed a canary flying up to her and sitting on her shoulder. And Charlotte got very excited about this. She started talking a bit about the bird, and then after that she demonstrated that when she gets it close to her lips, the canary kisses her. And right after she did that, she held the bird close to Werther's lips and let it kiss him too. And then right after that, she decided to feed the bird by placing a seed on her lip and letting the canary eat from them. And I don't know, maybe I'm the one who's weird here and like puritan or something, I have no idea. But to me, it just seems wrong, you know? Like, especially given that she's married and she's hanging out with a guy who is clearly infatuated with her, and she's doing something like this. I don't know, like, to me it just feels a little bit wrong. And you know, I know that it's not cheating and it's very, very innocent, like a very innocent situation, but at the same time it has implication. And just like given the whole context of the situation and of their friendship, I don't know, it's just that it doesn't really sit right with me. What do you think? Because maybe I am the one who's kind of weird here, but it just doesn't really sit right with me, especially considering that, you know, when you see this situation, it seems very innocent, but then when I think about myself, if I were married and I was like hanging with a guy who was clearly infatuated with me, it would feel so extremely wrong. Like, just, I don't know, like, it doesn't feel right. So you can tell me what you think about this, because maybe I am the one who's weird here. And then in one of his letters, Werther writes that it seems that Albert is not as happy in his marriage as he hoped to be, and definitely not as happy as Werther would have been. But, you know, to this I also have something to say, because, like, I think that Werther kind of has this idea that, you know, a relationship is those fireworks and butterflies and everything, and I just don't really think that a mature marriage is like this, you know? Like, I don't know, but then again, maybe I am just the one projecting here, but to me, like, when I imagine a healthy marriage, it's actually kind of boring in a sense. Or like, you can have fun, of course, but like the whole relationship, I would say, is more based on stability, you know, and not those like fireworks and yeah. So I don't know, but maybe I'm projecting because I am a pretty boring person, to be honest. So, and yeah, because then in the next couple of letters, Werther accuses everyone around of lacking the intense emotions that he himself feels, and then he begins to wonder what would happen if he passed away. And he concludes that even though his friends are extremely important to him, to the point where he feels that his heart could not beat without them, at the same time he concludes that they probably wouldn't grieve after him for long. And so Werther laments like this, also adding that everything is meaningless without Charlotte being his wife. In November, his state gets even worse, as every day he wakes up wishing that he would just pass away in his sleep, and on top of that he begins to drink a lot of wine. And he also begins to write as if he lost faith in God, which is pretty big considering that previously he was citing the Bible rather frequently. And of course he's still spending a lot of his time with Charlotte, who one time calls him Dear Werther, which of course makes him spiral even more, and then on top of that, one time she looks at him with a soft pity, which makes him feel seen by her. And then he gets even worse, as one time she was playing the piano and he noticed the ring on her finger and he started to cry and then yelled at her to stop playing. She did, and then she said that he seems to be ill and so he should rather go and compose himself. And so soon Werther was not able to think about anything other than Charlotte and her beautiful dark eyes. Then, as Werther descends further into madness, he begins to regularly wander through nature at night, and one time, as he's doing so, he notices a great flood that puts the entire Volheim under the water. As he sees it, he stands over a cliff and thinks about jumping, but he finds himself incapable of doing so, as he feels that it's not yet his hour to die. But soon his desire to end everything begins to mix with his obsession towards Charlotte, making him even more unstable than before. And everything gets even worse when one time Charlotte invites Werther to her house in order to end their complicated relationship. And so he comes to her house and he finds her here alone and busy as she's preparing some gifts for her siblings for the upcoming Christmas. To this, Werther starts talking about the happiness of the children, and Charlotte tells him that he too will get a gift, but only if he behaves himself. In response, he asks what does she mean, and Charlotte explains to him that during Christmas Eve everyone will be here and everyone will get a small gift, including Werther, but only if he promises that he won't come to her house before that day. And now Werther is of course taken aback by this, and Charlotte tries to tell him that it's all for her own peace of mind, as they just can't continue seeing each other in the same manner as before. And Werther is not happy about this, as he begins to walk up and down the room while repeating her words in anger. And then after a moment he says that he will never see her again, to which Charlotte tries to calm him down, and she says that in reality, he is kind of deceiving himself because it's only the impossibility of possessing her that makes her so desirable in his eyes. But Werther is of course not having this, and so he accuses her of being cold towards him and then says that soon all will be well. To which Charlotte just repeats that he should not come here before Christmas, and before he's able to answer, Albert enters the room. And now the atmosphere becomes rather distant and pretty cold, and so soon after that Werther leaves. And then as he returns home, he locks himself in his room, throws himself on the bed and cries his eyes out. And he's not able to let go of his emotional agony for a long time, and because of that he eventually begins writing his final letter to Charlotte. In the letter he states that now everything is over, as he has decided to die, and he assures Charlotte that this time he's writing those words without any romantic passion, but only as a cold declaration, especially considering that this letter shall be given to her after his lifeless body is already buried deep in the ground. Oh, it got so dark. Not the story, but also like the lighting. It's going to rain, I think. And Werther also adds here that one of the three of them has to die, and then he admits that in the beginning he considered sacrificing her husband, then her, but then ended up choosing to sacrifice himself. And then he ends the letter by writing that he just wishes for Charlotte to remember him from time to time, and then he begins to cry even though he felt collected when he started the letter. Following that, we learn that Werther started preparing everything under the excuse of going for a journey, and then he also met with Charlotte's siblings for one last time. And the children were very happy to see him. They were dreaming about the upcoming Christmas, and then one of the boys told him that they prepared some special New Year's wishes for him. And that of course was extremely hard for Werther to hear, and so he later drove away with tears in his eyes. Oh no, you barely see me now. It kind of looks awful. It kind of looks like I am a ghost talking to you. Maybe I actually am. You never really know who you watch on the internet. Maybe that's actually the vibe. Because Werther is kind of like going through it. Now what to do. Actually, maybe let's make it even darker. I don't know if it's going to work. What am I even doing with my life? It's kind of fun though. Okay, but you know what? This is actually not a bad idea with the candle. And you may ask, don't you have electricity in Poland? Well, we do have it, just I don't know, it doesn't really give you the same vibe, you know? Actually, if you agree with me, then you have to watch the movie Barry Lyndon by Stanley Kubrick. Such a great movie. If you like my videos, you're going to like this movie, like 100%. Because, you know, I have those like paintings and everything here. Because at least as far as I know, in the movie, Kubrick did not use any artificial lighting. And this is like a period movie, basically. Costumes and everything. I don't know, I don't remember the century. I think it's like 18th century or something like that. Yeah, I think it was 18th century. And when it comes to the scenes that were shot during the night, then like, as far as I know, the lighting was 100% natural, with just like a lot of candles. I don't know if I can post you some screens from the movie, but I will if I can. And yeah. Go watch it if you like stuff like this, because you're going to like it. And also, like, the whole movie just looks like paintings, basically. It's so amazing. Okay. Going back to the story, because I'm boring you probably. Sorry that I'm sometimes talking so much about stuff that are not on the topic. Following that, we move to Charlotte's house and we see her alone as Albert had to go to another city for the day. And so she lies down and she begins to wonder. She thinks that Albert really is an ideal for a husband, almost as if he were a special gift from heaven to ensure her happiness. But then on the other hand, she couldn't lie to herself, because Werther indeed became extremely important to her, as they seem to have this special connection of hearts that she didn't want to lose. But the problem is that she doesn't really feel anything romantic towards him, and so she would rather have him as a brother, or at least marry him with one of her friends. But then as she thinks for a moment which one of her friends would suit him, she quickly realizes that she wants him all to herself. But then as she's still very deep in her thoughts, suddenly she hears Werther's steps on the stairs, and for the first time her heart beats differently for him. And so he enters the room, and she of course bashes him for coming, but he says that after all he did not really promise anything. And in the beginning, Charlotte tried to do everything in her power not to be alone with him in the room, but her friends were busy doing something else, and so after some time she just sat down next to him as usual. They spoke a bit about books, and then Werther began to read some of the songs of Ocean to her. And the songs were so tragic and they related to their situation so much that after a while Charlotte began to cry, causing Werther to stop reading. He then grabbed her hand and began to weep as well, and they stayed like this for a while until Werther rested his head on her shoulder. She trembled and wanted to leave, but sorrow and sympathy made her stay and tell Werther to continue reading. He did, and then after he read a fragment about a character her, lamenting that tomorrow he will no longer be among the living, Werther began to cry once again. He threw himself at Charlotte's feet, grabbed her hands, and then pressed them to his eyes. And to this, Charlotte leaned towards him, and soon after that, Werther began to kiss her. She quickly started telling him to stop, and when he did, she said that he will never see her again, and then she left the room. Werther then spent the next half an hour in the same position, sitting on the floor and resting his head on the sofa. And then he stood up, he shouted that he says goodbye to her forever, and then he left. After that, he spent the next couple of hours wandering near the cliff during a dark and stormy night, and after he got home, he went to sleep. The next morning, he wrote another letter to Charlotte, lamenting about his love for her and also about his inevitable death. And he gets a bit crazy here because he writes that now Charlotte belongs to him and he's going to go to their Father in heaven, where he's going to wait for her while being comforted both by God and by Charlotte's mother. And after he finishes the letter, he calls for his servant and tells him to go to Albert and borrow the pistols from him. And following that, we move for a moment back to Charlotte's house. And we see here Charlotte sitting and wondering whether she should tell Albert about everything that happened, as previously her thoughts had always been completely exposed to him. But now she was afraid about destroying the pleasant atmosphere of their marriage, and so because of that, after Albert came back home, she just told him that Werther was here for an hour and she left it at that. And soon after, Werther's servant came into their house and gave Albert the note, and upon reading it, Albert ordered to give Werther the pistols and wish him a pleasant journey. And now those words made Charlotte's heart skip a beat, and she rose from her seat half fainting, and then she almost unconsciously went up to the pistols. She took them down with shaking hands and wanted to delay this moment even more, but Albert looked at her impatiently. So she gave the servant the pistols, and shortly after that she left the room. And now Charlotte knew what was about to happen, but she decided not to tell anyone about this, as she figured that it's now too late to do anything. And then her own emotional turmoil was definitely worsened by a short note where Werther wrote to her that because she was the one who gave the pistols to the servant, it's almost as if Werther will now receive his death from her hands, which was his greatest wish all along. After that, we learned that Werther wrote his last farewell letters both to his friend Wilhelm and also to Albert, whom he apologized for destroying the peace of his marriage. And then during the night, Werther writes his final letter to Charlotte. He begins it by writing that all is silent around him and his soul is calm, even though he's not able to think about anything other than her. He also writes that in another letter he asks her father to take care of his remains and also to bury them under his favorite tree. And then Werther expresses how happy he is to sacrifice himself for Charlotte, and then makes a wish to be buried in his iconic clothes along with a pink ribbon that Charlotte wore on the day they've met. After that, he writes that midnight has finally come, and with that, it's time for him to go. The following morning, the servant came into his room and found him stretched upon the floor, covered in blood and with a pistol at his side. But the servant noticed that Werther was actually still alive, and so he quickly sent for a doctor and for Albert. And now, as the servant was telling Albert what has happened, Charlotte came up to them and then fainted upon hearing the news. Soon, the doctor came into the room, examined Werther, and said that even though he was still alive, nothing could be done at this point. And Albert also came into the room, and they then cleaned Werther a bit of his blood and laid him down on the bed, his body motionless as if dead, but his lungs still breathing. At the very end, some of Charlotte's siblings came to say goodbye to him, and at 12 o'clock, Werther has finally died. So that was the whole story of the sorrows of young Werther. And now, in the beginning of the video, I kinda teased you a bit with this additional part of the Werther Fever, and as you probably figured, it of course included ending your own life in the same manner as Werther. And I really think that this whole story and also this trend point to the danger of living without a clear purpose. Because think about this, if Werther had a purpose in his life, but like a true meaningful purpose, you know? So not just something like, oh, maybe this is going to be my purpose, or maybe that is going to be my purpose, but like an actual meaningful purpose, then he would do everything in his power to stay concentrated on this purpose, you know? And I don't think that it would even be hard for him to do, because when you really, really care about something, then it's kind of easier to, you know, sacrifice something else for it. So like sacrifice your pleasures or something like that if you have this like clear purpose that you live for. And so if Werther had a purpose like this, then he would not be so easily swayed in another direction by his intense emotions. But he did not have that, and so instead of striving for something meaningful, he was just at mercy of his own emotions and passions. And I think that it's quite dangerous to live like this, because like emotions are incredible, of course they are, and I even think that being sensitive is incredible, because yeah, if you are able to manage your sensitivity, then it's wonderful, because then you have such a flavor to emotions, you know. So it can be very, very great, but I think that it's incredibly important that you just have to take more responsibility for your emotions, especially if you're sensitive. And I don't mean it in a harsh way, but just like I really genuinely believe that it makes your life so easier when you are able to be responsible with your emotions, or like for your emotions. When you take responsibility for your emotions, then you also gain a lot of autonomy, and I think that it's incredible. And think about this all in the context of Werther. So like he did not have a clear purpose in his life, and because of that he was just kind of floating around, and suddenly he was just pulled in with this intense infatuation for Charlotte. And so for him that was basically the end, because he was never really responsible for his emotions, and so because of that he was kind of like at the mercy of life. Like life was just happening to him and he did not have any sort of control over it. But yeah, if he did take responsibility, then he would have to notice that he has to stop putting himself in situations where his infatuation just keeps growing and growing to the point where it just became his whole life. And like really think about this, because even when he left to the city, you can kind of say that he was trying to do this, but I don't really think so, because we know that when he was spending his time with Miss B, then he was literally talking about Charlotte to her all the time. So like, you know, so it's not only about not putting yourself physically in situations, but also about having control over what you're thinking about. But you know, then at the end of the day, take everything that I say with a grain of salt, because like, you know, different situations are different. And I think that in general, it's very important to have balance in your life and not have this, you know, black and white thinking. So like, when it comes to taking responsibility for your emotions, I personally love to do this because it just gives me so much peace. I don't know, I just love it so much, and I really think that it makes your life a bit better. But then, you know, balance is the key. It really is. Because on the other hand, I think that comforting each other as humans is also incredibly important, and we should never lose this ability. So, you know, balance. Let's have balance to everything. Because then when you take too much responsibility, then you can kind of like really detach yourself from others, and that's not that nice, you know? So yeah, the truth is always somewhere in the middle, I think. And now, you know, coming back to this whole like purpose of life thingy, when it comes to Werther, I don't think that his purpose was actually to be an artist. I don't really think so. I think that he liked the idea of being an artist, but I don't think that his heart wanted that. Because I think that when it comes to the purpose that came from his heart, I kind of see him as someone who would work with children, because he had such a great skill, and children really liked him. So maybe something like a teacher, something like that. I think that he would be amazing in a role of a teacher, because obviously he has the knowledge, and obviously he is incredible when it comes to his contact with children. Then, you know, at the end of the day, this is a fictional character, so that's the first thing. And another thing is that I don't really know, but yeah, when I kind of like analyze his character, then I think that he would be great in the role of a teacher, actually. And look, I know that his connection with children was probably supposed to be, you know, sort of like this thing that pointed us to the idea that Werther himself was kind of like a child. I know, but I think that, you know, if your imperfection gives you purpose in life and also helps other people, then is it really that important that this is an imperfection? I don't really think so. Like, I don't know. Everyone is imperfect in some sort of way, but like, if you have a purpose and you help others, then that's so great. You know, that's so much better than being perfect. Another question that I think is very important to ask is, did Werther actually love Charlotte? And I think that the answer to this question is no. Because when you really think about this, yes, we can talk about infatuation and obsession, but I don't really think that it's fair to say that every sort of attachment can be called love. And I just think that we should really pay attention to this, because when you look at what people call love, then it gets kind of weird, because it's like the word almost lost the meaning at this point, you know? Like, so many things can be called love, and it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't really sit right with me. Maybe because to me love is such a sacred thing that I want a clear definition on that. And so I'm going to give you a fragment that I personally use whenever I have to judge whether something is love or not. And of course it comes from the Bible. The famous fragment that reads, "Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." And also, like, you may see that this fragment is a little bit different than the one that you usually hear, and that's because this is a NRSV translation that I personally use. And I use it because I guess I am a little bit annoying when it comes to the precision of the words. So yeah, sorry for that. But yeah, going by that fragment, we can clearly see that Werther did not feel love towards Charlotte. Of course, that is if we take this definition. I'm going to use it because I just believe that it's true. And yeah, I just personally believe that we should never call an obsession like this with the word love, because it just isn't. It's not love. Yeah, and actually, you know, if you're not Christian, then still I encourage you to, like, find the definition of love that you're going to like. Because then, you know, someone can tell you like, "Oh, I love you," and but they don't behave like this, you know? And so it's like, and I don't mean that the person is like malicious for that or something, but maybe they are just confused, and maybe they are going to make you confused, you know? So it's just, when you have definitions behind words, especially words like this, then you're just going to save yourself from so much confusion in the world. And I think that it's incredible. Maybe because I personally don't like to be confused. Like, confusion is one of the worst things that I can feel, to be honest, because it's like, no. And so, what are the last conclusions? I think that Werther really would have an easier time if he noticed that what he feels is not love, but an obsession. Because, like, think about this. When he thought that what he feels is love, then suddenly, you know, he had this like romantic idea of this tragic love, and just it sounded so good and meaningful and everything. But if he noticed that it was actually not love, but just an obsession and infatuation, then, you know, it doesn't sound so romantic anymore, and that grand. And so, and you know, I'm talking about this here as if I don't support infatuation or something like this. No, I think that infatuation is pretty normal. You know, everyone experiences that from time to time, and to be honest, humans go a little bit crazy sometimes when they get infatuated, and I think that it's pretty normal. Like, when you really like someone and you just kind of like, you just lose your mind. It happens. Like, it just happens, and you can be a smart, well-adjusted person, and still you're going to see someone and just all the reason is gone from your head. And I think that it's pretty normal, to be honest. Maybe because I also like to watch like nature documentaries and you know, like David Attenborough style and everything. And when you see animals, they go crazy when it comes to getting in pairs. And so I think that when it comes to humans, then like, of course we are a little bit different than other animals, but like at the end of the day, we are animals. And so like getting in pairs, that's pretty important. It's pretty important. So I don't know why getting a little bit crazy while you are infatuated would be seen as wrong, you know? I think that what can be wrong is what you actually do with your infatuation. Because you're human, you actually are conscious of your state of infatuation, or at least you should be. But yeah, because of that, you know, when you recognize that you're infatuated with someone, then like you really have to kind of manage that, you know, and yeah, figure out like if you have a chance with the person, then like try to turn it into love. But if you don't, then you know you have to do everything in your power to kind of stop being infatuated, I guess, because otherwise you're just going to drive yourself crazy, like Werther did. And so, yeah. So, you know, state of infatuation, I think it's a normal human thing. Even like going a little bit insane because of this, I think it still is pretty normal, but staying in this state for too long is very, very bad for you. And yeah, and just like something has to be done with a state like this. Either just stop thinking, stop reminding yourself of the person, and just wait for the infatuation to go away, or actually, you know, take some steps to change the infatuation to love. I think that's the most like reasonable thing to do. And so yeah, with that, this is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially that you're watching till the end. You can subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be very happy if you do, and bye bye.